Okay, welcome everyone to Leeds Theosophical Society and our latest Zoom meeting, which is the first in the autumn programme. The last one we had was in June. We have a programme now arranged up to Christmas, same time every fortnight, 2 p.m. on Sundays, and we'll be sending around details of what we've got to offer as and when. So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. And today we welcome a regular to Leeds Theosophical Society, a man who's been working with us for many years, both at the lodge itself and indeed on Zoom. So welcome to Chad Manian, who, as you all know, is an international academic and a man full of interesting and highly original ideas. So welcome, Chad. And today he's going to be speaking about the revolving door of human progress. So, Chad, over to you.
Right. Firstly, welcome everybody. Right. So thank you all for being here today. It is a pleasure to be back at the Theosophical Society, especially Leeds. Good to see everybody. It's my top talk today. It's on a topic that I've done a little bit of research on. I don't believe I've shared this particular topic or spoken about this before. It's the revolving door of human progress. Now, what is the revolving door of human progress? When I came up with this topic some time ago, essentially, I was doing some research into cycles, mainly sort of looking at how civilization rises and falls and develops. So this began following a research paper that I wrote a year and a half ago about the story of civilization and about something called historical patterns. Now, a little bit about myself. I started my career in the capital markets as a trader and an analyst. And eventually, at the end of the first collapse in 2008, that time, I was among the first to predict the collapse a year before, left the capital markets, became an academic, and eventually started teaching, lecturing, and eventually did a bit of research. And my academic career, I've ended up doing a lot of work supervising students, but also publishing on my areas of expertise, which is markets, patterns, and looking at how things develop. I've worked on a number of projects, but mainly what I do is advise both governments, large corporations on future-proofing their ideas. So today's topic is mainly a little bit about historical process, the culmination of my thoughts on the subject of human behavior and human progress, about how civilizations work. It's interdisciplinary, its nature. I look back at human nature and history, historical processes, and how cycles operate. We've got behavioral cycles, natural cycles in the world. We have market cycles and cycles of expansion, contraction, human development, growth, progress, and crises. So a brief look back at history. So this is just a timeline. I always go back to the very beginning. 4.5 billion years when the Earth was first formed. 400 million years where the first living beings came up. 2 million years when the human brain size increased and the appearance of the early hominids began. Right up to 50,000 years when the Stone Age supposedly began, all the way down to when, civilization developed, and right down to the first Great Depression in 1927. And then we have, the global credit crisis in 2007 and the end of the Mayan calendar, which was supposed to be in 2012. So this is just a brief timeline of the key events in our society. Now, if you, like me, have an inclination, a logical inclination to look for patterns, you will probably see a mini to a larger cycle in human history on progress, development, and collapses. Now, this forms the basis of my, talk today. So I have done a lot of work in my, consulting and financial market career as a strategist, looking at larger cycles of how expansion, contraction, creation, and, deterioration happens. So if I look at what's happening right now, the zeitgeist of this current time period, we're going through a time of major change, transformation, upheaval. And there is also a spirit of nostalgia. There's also widespread panic. So if any of you have seen what's happened in the last week and, yesterday, in fact, where you had more than 100,000 people descend on, central London, there's been a current development of crackdowns and counter-revolutions right across the world. There's right now mass dissent, but there's also a feeling of nostalgia, a romantic notion of the past to try and, look at the country, the nation, our history, and almost revisiting that. So there is a divergence of consciousness, what we'd call a duality, a chasm develop in the world. You can see it everywhere. We're in an age of polarization right now where there is massive divergence between people. Everybody disagrees on something right now. So this is what's been happening right now. People are very concerned about, increasing deterioration of our freedoms people have taken for granted. There's also a worry and a concern that there's widespread, monitoring of people. And there is, again, a reaction to that, which has also been noted. Now, why does this matter? It matters because we're currently living in an age of transition. We're in a time where technology has long advanced or surpassed beyond the speed of human evolution. Technology is developing more rapidly than human beings are. Well, that's the bottom line. Human potential itself is largely unexplored. In the old days, human potential was what people would look at exploring. If you look at the old theosophical and the anthroposophical Steiner tradition, if you look at what people valued in the Renaissance for the last 500 years, it was all about developing the human being in the old world. The new world is all about developing technology. And Steiner once said that we will overdevelop one aspect of science at the expense of our soul development. That's what you've been seeing. We can invent problems, medicines, vaccines, and diseases sooner than we can solve these issues. This is what led to Steiner making a comment that we will eventually develop one aspect of the mind at the expense of the soul. What do the Theosophists say? They say we're living in the final age, the period of transition, the fourth yuga, Kali Yuga, the dark age. It's also the time of the fourth industrial revolution, the time of Web 2.0, 4.0, Internet of Things, the digitization of everything, and excessive commodification. We're in a time where even education in this world, the modern education system, schools, colleges, and universities are over-commercialized to a point where everything is being bought and sold without any consideration to what its purpose is meant to be. So people are making an observation. If you're like me, if you're an academic, if you've been in the education sector for as well, if you've seen it in the last 10, 20 years, you see that there is no more education. There is a commercialization of the process of buying and selling, degrees. People are not really learning. They have the illusion that they're learning. But if you look at what people are actually doing with it, you see a completely different picture. So we're in an age of excessive commercialization, corporatization, and now digitization. What do we have coming in? Right now, we're also in an age where there's a reaction to the, over commercialization and control. We're also seeing decentralization of money and money creation. This means the redefining of value. So when you have change in the economic systems and the process, you also have a reaction to that. When there's a revolution, there's always a counter-revolution. And in the economic terms, you have a redefining of value. And so when you have digital transformation, you have digitally led transformation of money creation and money supply. At some point, people figured out that you can build technology, which means you can create your own version of money. And that's what led to, the whole idea of blockchain and digital cryptocurrency. That is a reaction to the excessive control of the money process, of how it's created, transmitted, circulated, and controlled. We also have a rise in AI. So change in medical technology. So there are scientific breakthroughs that can come from it. They haven't yet, but they will at some point. When you have a change, the use of AI and technology in a positive way, it can help solve many problems. So yes, medical technology, that is a positive aspect that can help create a lot of benefit for the world, for society. Once we have scientific and medical breakthrough, there will be a shift in productivity and a change in the way manufacturing happens. We now have direct, manufacturing to end user. That's one of the biggest breakthroughs that's happened, which means you have a shortening of supply chain. So anything you want, you can essentially create on demand. That's a positive aspect that we're yet to see. The other thing is a change in labor policy and HR. So the focus is change in working patterns. People's jobs will change because of technology. That's something that, everybody has known for a long while. It also means you have change in working times and certain jobs no longer existing and newer jobs coming into creation. In the UK, we have massive changes to how financial regulations work in relation to online, blockchain technology. So they had something called the Joint Code of Governance. So there is right now an increase in sensitivity to digital technological ethics, which never existed. On the one hand, we're living in very unethical times where there is a diminishing of ethical behavior. However, you have more sensitivity towards ethical conduct. That's also happening. So you see things developing like an arms race. Something gets worse, something else gets better. You're seeing both things happen at the same time. So there's also more investment and funding to invest in digital assets and alarms. So, and the alarm bell that's being raised here is there's more creation of digital assets. The alarm is, are they real digital assets or are they just fake assets? That's the alarm bell. You're going to see more of a shift towards the digital world and digital value with the development of what they call the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things means you can essentially buy or find everything that you're looking for to some extent. The Internet of Everything is the iteration that develops on that. The next generation is the Internet of Things, Internet of Everything. There's what they call the deep net, or the dark web, as they would call it in the old days, and growth of shadow finance. Now, what is shadow finance? This is the third capital sector. It's a world that very few know about. In my previous career, I used to, advise banks and financial institutions about this, the deep net. So this is a sort of a phase of the online world which most people don't know exists and very few have access to. It's an ocean which only very few have access to, and the ones that have access to this are mainly either high-level government institutions, intelligence sector community operators, and the not so good, the dodgy, the terrorists and the criminal networks. They're the only ones that have the sophistication to tap into the deep net. But in there is a shadow financial sector which had gradually grown in the last 40 years, and it's now worth trillions. So that's something where organizations and countries and governments buy and sell things like arms and ammunitions, all sorts of technology and things that very few people even know about. We're seeing that sector start to spill out into the Internet of Everything. There's also the rise of what I would call the cryptopia and the emergence of a cryptocracy. So this is a world where technological operators have established themselves and they've built their own little utopia. Mainly people who buy, sell, create their own digital assets, if you can call it that. And people who are technologically more aware, they're the only ones who've created a sort of elite rule in this world. That's what we call the cryptocracy. Those that can build or mine their own digital coin. This is what we've currently seen happening throughout the world. Now, what happens when that tends to grow? You essentially have a development of this fourth industrial revolution at the end of the Victorian Age. Modern digitization is essentially a byproduct of what was begun in the Industrial Revolution, the Victorian Age. In the Victorian Age, you had the development of the locomotion and the steam engine. What we know clearly is that human society and history tends to follow cyclical patterns. Time itself, as we were discussing earlier, is a phenomena that is not fully understood. This is why I would say human progress is essentially a revolving door. You go in and you come out the same way sometimes. Economies and societies rise and fall just like the ebb and flow of tides. That's what led me to asking a question. Is there a discernible pattern in history? Some say so. I'm going to take you back to the 1920s, where there was a Russian thinker, a genius of his age, an economist, mathematician, philosopher called Nikolai Kondratiev. He came up with the idea of the Kondratiev wave, a theory which suggests that there is a supercycle, which refers to the cyclical tendency in the world's economy. In 1928, the Soviet economist during Stalin's time, Kondratiev argued that the world experiences these inevitable periods of pulses, as he would call it, the rise, plateau, and a fall. He named these periods waves due to the shape that these cycles produce when you plot them on a graph. In the financial markets, we use these to predict and calculate cycles. According to Kondratiev, the average length of one cycle is 50 years on average. He believed that human societies follow a seasonal development phase, just like the 4 seasons that we have. Seasons are very natural because, life in the world, if you take 1 year, it goes through these 4 seasons. That's similar to Kondratiev's 4 phases. The first is spring, when the world economy is at a plateau or just beginning to improve. Summer is when the economy starts to pick up and speed up, and there is a great deal of prosperity. Fall is what begins as a recession and another plateau or period of stagnation, while winter is what you'd call the depression, the winter of our discontent. Some believe we're in a depression. In 1920, Kondratiev, while he was in a gulag, he said a few things which the Soviets didn't like, especially Stalin. He didn't think too kindly of Kondratiev's economic wave when he predicted the Soviet Union will eventually collapse. He predicted that 40 years before. And, they sent him to a gulag. And while he was in prison, he came up with this idea. And he came up with this graph in 1920. And he looked at this 50-year cycle, the first Kondratiev period of prosperity, depression, recession, depression, and improvement. The steam engine and the cotton industry started to boom. Then you had railway and steel in the 1850s. Then the third phase is electrical, chemical, and the engineering in the 1900s. Then you also had the Great Depression in America, which he predicted. And then you had the rise in the 1950s of the end of Second World War, petrochemical and automobiles. Then you had information technology, Silicon Valley in the 90s, the fifth Kondratiev period. So while he was serving time in the Gulag, Nikolai Kondratiev identified three phases in the cycle, which was expansion, stagnation, and recession. So more common today is a division into the four periods with a turning point or a collapse between the expansion and stagnation phase. In the 1920s, he proposed to apply this theory to the 19th century, but he then discovered something purely by accident in one of his phases when he was suffering in the Gulag. He found that between the 1790s and 1849, there was a turning point in the middle of the cycle at 1815. Later, he plotted between the 50s and 1896, there was a turning point in 1873. So he then reached the conclusion that in 1896, a new cycle had started. And the long cycle supports, according to him, affects all sectors of an economy. He also looked at the prices of goods and services in an economy and the interest rates. And what he saw was the ascendant phase, which when you look at it today at the Dow Jones or the Nasdaq, you can see the same thing: increase in prices, low interest rates, while the other phase, you look at the decrease in price and very high interest rates. So this is why most analysts who look at this concentrate on the output. Now, when you look at something called a long wave, the first modern Kondratiev wave occurred in approximately around the early 1800 phase, with the development of cotton-based spinning and weaving, which went on until 1850. Where we are currently, our world is supposedly in the fall phase of the fifth wave, which started in 91. This wave deals with technological innovations, bioengineering, wireless, Wi-Fi, mobile, and the saturation point for this wave was supposed to be between 2010 and 2020. So approximately 2015 was the saturation point. Some Kondratiev psychoanalysts argue that global wars are also tied closely to the Kondratiev period. Especially there's one American sociologist, Wallerstein. According to him, global conflicts occur quite often just at the summer phase of a wave is starting. So when you have world production of goods and services on an upswing, so he theorized that this inflation was one of the early causes of such wars. Now, if you look at the Iraq war, when Enron was going through mass difficulty, the US-Iraq war, when it first started during the Bush administration, what happens at the end of that? There is a fall, and the winter phase of the wave then begins. You can almost see this recurrence like clockwork. The more important thing for us is the technological cycle, which we'd call the Industrial Revolution. The first, occurrence of this was in 1771. Then you have the age of steam and railway in 1829. The age of steel and heavy engineering was in the 1870s. Now we have the age of oil, electricity, and the automobile industry, the mass production in 1908, where you had manufacturing that grew. The Industrial Revolution of Information and Telecommunication, that began in 1971. So if you plot this on a chart, you see it in this way. Modern ramification, transforming material to transforming energy to transforming information. We're now in the space age or the information age of knowledge and algorithms. Now, beyond this point, we could see machines or machine AI or intelligence-led cycles, which would be a completely different iteration to the cycle. There's what you'd call the long wave forecast, 4 Kondratiev waves in the US. So if you look at that, you can also plot this from a financial astrology perspective. You'll see very similar phenomena. 1816 to 35, then you see 64 to 74, 1921 to 29. So that's an 8-year period. 82 to 2000 is where we're at, and then you have the winter phase. Now, how do you use this in a more practical sense? In the most practical sense, you do what Merrill Lynch would do. Merrill Lynch have developed this investment clock to play the global economic cycle. Because let's face it, the financial experts in the industry, especially the investment bankers, they use this. They even use mathematical models based on these long cycles and astrological wave phenomena. So the cycle of boom, slowdown, recession, and recovery. So if you look at what's going to happen in the economy right now, this gives you a very clear idea. What if you are not that way inclined? You're not really economically minded, or, somebody who's that into, the investment world. What if you're a theosopher or somebody who looks at it from a human perspective? Well, more interestingly, William Blake, one of the first, he considered this idea of longer cycles of human production, the revolving door of consciousness. He looked at it and he came up with this play once on Vala and the four Zoases. And he said, we live in an age of Urizen. So there are four energies: Luva, Urizen, Varnas, and Orthon. So to him, it symbolizes the energy of love, the energy of pure reason, the energy of feeling, awareness, and, the observer who looks at, and we're in an age of pure reason where reason triumphs over everything. The nature of Urizen is the nature of mind and logic. It wants to over-intellectualize everything. Like we started off by saying, the mechanization of everything is the hallmark of this phase we're in. Everything's about technology, and technology surpasses humanity. William Blake also said at the end of this, the idea of luva or love will overwhelm the other forces when there is enough people who are more conscious. We've experienced the culmination of this, what Steiner called the Ahrimanic. It's not about the soul, it's not about one's inner feeling or the art, it's all about the mechanism. It's all about the body, the machinery. We're going to see that wave reach its culmination and its end, and eventually the cycle will continue. So William Blake, who was very aware of what's going on, he saw the victory of Luva over Urizen, where he said, spirit will be triumphant over pure reason. We haven't reached that stage just yet, but we very well might. So this brings me to the concept of behavioral futurism. To know this will mean we have an understanding of the nature of time, to discover the flow of events. So there was one effort made by somebody who used to work in technology many years ago, and he left that world behind, a guy who calls himself Cliff High. He came up with the idea of web bots, where he sent out these algorithms, these bots all around the web to monitor people's discussion. And he found that there was a connection to the language that was being used. He developed this program called Asymmetric Linguistic Trend Analysis, ALTA, which looked at human consciousness mapped out from a point of the language they were using. And he would identify trends and patterns. Whenever there was something major about to happen, he would see a spike in the language people were using in their discussion forums, because he believed that the human conscious, subconscious is closely connected. And whenever there was something dreadful about to happen, like before the tsunami, before, earthquakes, people would pick up on it, and the subconscious dialogue of the language people used would react before. He called it release language. And that was one of the early forms of research. I was involved with a similar research in, the early, 2000s at some point, where we were looking at this thing called REG, random event generator, random number generator. If you flip a coin hundreds of times in a minute, you will see that there is a pattern of heads or tails. Sometimes it's not purely random. In certain periods, it would skew more towards one or the other. where you could almost measure shifts in collective human consciousness. So when there was a shift in one trend, one direction, it would mean that there is more positivity or more negativity or more depression. So you could almost classify the human map of where things were going. And then you can work out what is the cycle of emotion. So I developed this early concept of emotional cycles and patterns in collective unconscious behavior. It led me to conclude at one of the conferences I was speaking at the time, I care not for the state of the past as long as I can look into the future. And at that time, a younger me was more interested in being able to predict. I was very interested in that because I was very good at it. And that's where I'd make a lot of money from in my younger financial, days. I left that world behind, but what I learned from it was very clear that there definitely is a way you can look into human behavior as a yardstick of knowing where the future is going. The basic assumptions of my model was the future is uncertain and unknown, but time is relative, history repeats itself, and event patterns recur and are therefore possibly predictable. Whilst reality is a moving target, if you know one possible outcome, you would change it. And of course, to know the past, you will recreate the future again. So at that point, we were all in a very different phase. Of course, what I learned from that time in my life to what I've learned, where I am now is I no longer try and predict the future. I'd rather create the future. And that's exactly what I'm talking to you about. The revolving door. It's about civilizations. Civilization rises and falls, but it's governed and driven by evolution. While humanity has never formulated a law to govern historical facts or a sequence of facts, we do follow a predictable pattern of cycles. And the way we've done things in the past is usually how we do things in the future, unless we learn from it. So the evolution of civilization as a single rational system follows a path. There's originally growth in internal complexity and diversity in society, science, culture, and then you have the acceleration of self-organizational processes, increased levels of order and control. Once we think we know more, once we start to learn more, we start to develop an ego, and society begins to get more egotistical, and it seeks to take control of things and control humanity. Then you have growth in the influence of human civilization, on natural processes, and we start to go back towards nature. The aspects of civilization, we have cooperation, intelligent self-organization, involvement of the individual into the collective, and eventually accountability. That brings us to a point of symmetry. We don't really have much symmetry in things, but we will. So if you wonder what the future will be like, what the world will be like in the future, there are certain things that are inevitable. First of all, increased accountability. There will be more accountability and greater exposure of truth. You will at some point see the end of tyranny everywhere in the world. You will also see an advancing humanity, and certain things, especially disclosure of truths that have been repressed, they will come out eventually. When it becomes impossible to hide the truth, it becomes impossible to hide from truth. That'll create a shift in the way, we produce things, and the rise of sovereign individuals and sovereign communities. Human beings will eventually break free of tyranny, and it'll become impossible to govern and control people. From the mid to longer term, we are going to see change in the Western politics. You'll see more collapse or transformation. We're in that phase where you could see governments and economies collapse and fall and be forced to transform, especially insurance and money, banking. Those are the two next things to collapse. We're overdue a fall in that, especially the insurance sector. There's also going to be an end to the current leadership or the type of leadership we've seen. So you had the US elections. I'm more interested to see the next election in a few years from now. What will happen there? That's going to be the very interesting shock. You're also going to see the fall of China, or this communist regime. That's going to collapse eventually at some point. You'll also see the rise of Africa and the end to human trafficking and modern day slavery. People who go to work tend to become wage slaves. There will be an end to that soon. What does the secret doctrine have to say from Blavatsky's perspective? The synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy was published in 2 volumes in the 1880s, originally by H.P.B. The first volume was named Cosmogenesis, and the second was Anthropogenesis. She said we're going to see the end of the 5th root trace and the emergence of the 6th, and a return to a more enhanced being. She also prophesies the destruction of this racial or genetic failures of nature as the higher mind ascends. So the current humanity, the one that we see, race after race, it'll perform its appointed cycle, pilgrimage. Was she talking about the deliberate manipulation and programming of the DNA of the present human being? The current mRNA vaccinated species of human? Is that what she was talking about, I wonder? The technosapien. The turn of the wheel is what we're looking at. We're on track for the 6th root race to appear, which is the next generation of children that are being born on this earth. There'll be a combination of the previous that would add a distinctive flavor to its development. It would also spring up as a sub-race and evolve out of the remnant of the 5th. So our children's children, our grandchildren, and their children onwards will leave their own contribution to the chain, and they'll be more conscious in nature and less consumptive. So if we look at this from a theosophical cycle of the 7 globes of the earth chain, old theosophy, the 1st to the 7th, from the archetypal plane to the intellectual, to the substantial or physical formation, to the material plane. We also have in old theosophy the 7 yugas, from the golden age to the silver age to the bronze to the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness. The age of technology is essentially the turning point. The dark age will eventually end, and some say that dark age has already begun its end, and we are heading to an age of the bronze, or head back towards the Dwapara Yuga and onwards to the silver, and then we'll get back to the gold. That's what some say. Here's why I think theosophy is so needed right now. An age where wisdom, morality, and knowledge of the way is fading, it becomes more necessary. The world needs more chivalry, continuity, and linkage to the old world. Without that direct thread, that chain of connection to the past, people will end up being lost in the modern world. Those old values need to be brought back. So if you look at, Alice Bailey, Ledbetter, Master DK, Blavatsky, Krishnamurti, all of these guys, Swedenborg, William Blake, all their teachings, it set forth a treasure trove for future generations that needs to be preserved and revisited. So the organization that we have, like the TS or Steinhaus, the organization may fall, but its knowledge will always survive. There was a physicist called Freeman J. Dyson who once was asked this question by a colleague or learned friend of mine, and the answer he got: what happens when light, starts off in the material world, develops into planets and stars are formed? Eventually, stars in the galaxy, they turn into supernova, they blow their fuel, and, what happens then when stars go into heat depth? Will consciousness still survive? And his answer was shocking. Said, regardless of what happens, consciousness will always be preserved, even if it's only in charged particles of light. And to those that know how to access that, infinite possibilities exist for one who knows where to look. So it essentially gives me a lot of hope. The biggest fear of Kali Yuga is we will end up like previous civilizations. Where we are right now, We're at the end of this period. And this is why I feel no matter what happens, true knowledge will always return as long as there are seekers alive to seek. It will always be found. So if we go back and remember the Arthurian legend, where King Arthur is at his final moment and he tells Percival, take Excalibur and throw it in the lake. And Percival goes and he fails the first 2 times. And he comes back and he says, well, Excalibur cannot be lost. This is a great merit for all society. We cannot let this treasure be lost to mankind. And Arthur says to him, when the world is ready, the king will return, the sword will rise again. Therefore, theosophy has always existed, and knowledge is like a weed that will always keep growing. It'll break through concrete rocks to rise. And we, individuals, humans that seek true knowledge, were like the library for the world. In the time of the Druids, they wrote down nothing, but they had an oral tradition. Each single individual Druid was himself or herself the living library, and I believe that is what we are. We carry with us, within our DNA, that living library. And no matter what happens, as long as we're alive and breathing, we will continue to be that living library, affecting the world in a positive way. What if things don't get worse, but they get better, and we're actually going to a golden age? We have no idea what the people of the future will look like, but I always say, regardless, he who would create the new must endure the passing of the old with ease and tranquility. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That is my topic.
Thank you very much indeed, Chad, for, as always, a very thought-provoking, original, and very interesting view of cycles, something that I've always been interested in. I have a question, first of all, Eddie. You were talking about 2/3 of the way through about what you called emotional cycles made up of collective consciousness of form, which can impact upon machines. I mean, obviously, you'll be aware of the very interesting work that has been done by the Institute of Noetic Sciences with random number generators work, which has been going on for some decades and which is continuing now, and I believe it's being expanded. But when you do get these big events, 9/11 or Princess Diana, it seems that these random number generators not only react to it, but they seem to have a predictive ability about them as well. And when they've tested these things, they've shown people cards with highly emotional images, ones that evoke great love or great anger or hatred. And people have reacted to these cards a split second before they actually see the image. And this is something which absolutely fascinates me. And I'd be very interested to hear your take on this and how you would interpret this.
Well, yes, the REG and also the Alta, they both, WebBots, had a very similar outcome where the predictive value, that's what we call it technically. So any event, pre-event and post-event, there is what we call a certain predictive value, which means before something significant happens, you can pick it up in the collective mood of the people. If you just, randomly bring a number of people, let's say a dozen to about 40, 50, so there's what we call the law of large numbers. If you ask a large number of people how they feel about a certain thing closer to an event, there'll be more of a tendency. The average feeling will either go towards one more positive or more negative. So you have a general idea of, the release language, or rather, what is the feeling. So when something, significant or something major, like an upheaval or a chaotic, traumatic event about to occur, there'll be more of a spike in the readings, and you can plot it on a chart. So that's where you see collective mood or social consciousness has its own emotional value. And you can also then narrow those findings down to what is the specific type of emotion. It's a little bit like if you, ask a number of people, what event, what do they see in their minds randomly? Most people will almost tell you that there is they'll give you an image, and this is something that remote viewers have done. Before an event, they can actually, more closely give you an indication of what sort of situation is developing. And that is actually one very interesting experiment that I've actually seen done, participated in, and it was very interesting to see the readings and the data from that. This was actually what was it? Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. His idea, morphic resonance, and also dogs and telepathy. That was among the first very interesting bits of studies that showed that everybody has this potential, and we've got lots of data showing us that before these events, people tend to pick up on this because of the collective mood. The collective psyche reacts to it before the event occurs. So yeah, that's slightly longer-winded answer to that question.
Just briefly, would you call this a collective consciousness or a collective unconsciousness? What's the most apt term to describe this?
I would call it collective superconscious, because that's the part of us that knows these things before, part of the higher self of every individual, that we're all connected to this something that picks up on these things. So it is the superconscious state. All of these things are accessible to the state of one's being. If you tune in, if you're a bit more relaxed, you can almost, zero in on these things. So yes, I would say it's a superconscious state that we're tapping into.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that. So in the meantime, have a very good week or fortnight, and we look forward to seeing you all again at some point in the future. And thank you again, Chad, for a truly magnificent talk. And it was very, very far-reaching. I love talks like this, which synthesize all kinds of stuff together. All right, everyone. Thank you very much, and goodbye from Yorkshire.
Bye. Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely weekend.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.